The axle snapped clean in half somewhere between dusk and full dark, and Elara Voss knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had already lost everything once before, that the Kansas plains had no interest in showing her mercy. She stood beside her listing wagon on the open trail east of Dodge City, the year 1878 pressing down on her like the summer heat that had not yet fully released its grip even at this late hour. The wagon tilted hard to the right, one rear wheel splayed out at a sickening angle, the iron rim half buried in the dry, cracked earth. Her horse, a patient gray mare named Juniper, stood still in the traces, ears flicked back with the quiet resignation of an animal that had learned to wait. The stars were beginning to pierce through the purple bruise of the evening sky, and the wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. Elara pressed both hands to her forehead and took stock of the situation with the practiced calm of a woman who had crossed 2 states alone in the past 3 months. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher by trade and by deep conviction, and she had been hired by the township of Millhaven, a small but determined settlement 12 miles west of Dodge, to take charge of its new schoolhouse. She had sold most of what she owned back in St. Louis after her mother passed in the spring, packed what remained into this wagon, and set her face west with a stubbornness that her mother had always called her finest and most aggravating quality. She crouched beside the broken axle and touched the split wood. It was not a crack that could be wedged or tied. The axle had sheared almost completely through, and the wagon tongue had dropped with it, throwing the whole rear end sideways. She had no spare axle. She had rope and canvas and a small lantern and 2 days of food, and she had her teaching certificates folded carefully in a tin box under the seat, and none of those things would fix what was broken. She straightened, pushed back the loose strands of dark hair that had escaped her braid, and looked down the trail in both directions. There was nothing in either direction. No light, no sound of other travelers, no distant glimmer of a settlement. Just the enormous Kansas sky and the grass in the dark. She retrieved her lantern from under the wagon seat and lit it with a match, setting it on the ground beside the wheel so she could see clearly what she was dealing with. Then she unhooked Juniper from the traces and tied her to the side of the wagon and gave her a handful of grain from the feed bag. She patted the mare's neck. "I do not know what we are going to do," she said quietly, "but I expect we will figure it out." That was when she heard the hoofbeats. They came from the west, measured and unhurried, a single rider moving at an easy lope. Her first instinct was wariness, which was a reasonable instinct for a woman alone on a dark trail in 1878 Kansas, and she moved to the other side of the wagon and reached under the seat for the short-barreled shotgun her father had pressed into her hands the day she left home. She did not point it at anything. She just held it. The rider slowed as he came close, and when the light of her lantern caught him, she saw a man on a dark bay horse, broad-shouldered and trail-worn, wearing a canvas duster that was gray with dust and a hat pulled low. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with several days of dark beard and eyes that, when they caught the lantern light, were the particular steady color of deep river water, more gray than blue. He looked at the tilted wagon and at the broken axle and at her, standing half behind the wagon with the shotgun held low, and he did not say a single word. He simply stepped down from his horse. He tied his horse to the back of her wagon beside Juniper, and the 2 animals regarded each other with a mild equine curiosity while he crouched beside the broken axle and examined it by the lantern light. He turned it over with his hands, probed the split, stood and went to his saddlebags, and began pulling things out with a methodical quietness that was so calm it was almost uncanny. He laid a length of heavy iron rod on the ground, and a coil of wire, and a leather wrap, and a small hand tool that she recognized after a moment as a farrier's rasp. She watched him from around the side of the wagon, the shotgun hanging loose in her hand, and she did not say anything either, partly because she was uncertain, and partly because there was something about the deliberate silence of him that did not feel threatening. It felt, strangely, like respect. like a man who had decided that what needed doing was more important than conversation about it. He worked with the rasp first, squaring off the broken ends of the axle. She could hear the steady scrape of iron on wood, and then the softer sounds of the wire being measured and cut. He fitted the iron rod alongside the axle as a splint, with the kind of precise, experienced hands that told her he had done this kind of repair before or something very like it. He was not guessing. He was working from knowledge, and he was working fast despite the care he was taking. Elara lowered the shotgun fully and rested it against the wagon wheel and crouched on the far side to hold the lantern higher, bringing more light to where he needed it. He glanced up at her once, a brief acknowledgement, and then went back to his work. The wire went around the rod and the axle in tight overlapping loops, each one pulled firm with a leverage she could hear even if she could barely see it in the close dark. Then the leather wrap went over the wire, lashed down with more wire at each end. He tested it with his hands, pushing and pulling at the repaired joint. He went to his horse again and came back with a small tin of something dark and pungent that she realized was bearing grease, and he worked it into every edge of the repair with his fingers. Then he raised the wagon. He did not have a jack, but he had a length of iron pry bar that he produced from a long leather scabbard on his saddle, and he used a flat stone from the edge of the trail as a fulcrum. The wagon was heavy, loaded with her things, and she watched him brace against the pry bar and lift the rear of the wagon with a steady, grinding effort, the muscles of his shoulders and back working visibly even through the duster. She moved without thinking about it, seizing the displaced wheel from the ground, and when the wagon rose high enough she slipped the wheel back onto the repaired axle spindle with a solid clunk. He held the wagon while she hammered the wheel nut back into place with a rock, working quickly, and when it was seated he lowered the wagon back down with the same careful control he had used for everything else. The wagon settled level, both rear wheels on the ground, the repaired axle holding. He stepped back and looked at it. She stepped back and looked at it. The night wind moved through the grass. Juniper shifted her weight. Elara looked at the man. He was wiping his hands on a rough cloth he had produced from his coat pocket, his face in shadow, and she had the odd sensation of looking at something she did not have a word for yet. She had been looked after before, by her father and by neighbors, and by the various small kindnesses of strangers on a long road. But she had never been helped like this, in silence, with a competence so complete and unself-conscious that it did not seem to expect anything in return. Not thanks, not conversation, not even recognition. He had simply seen what needed to be done and done it, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something deep and quiet and entirely unfamiliar. "Thank you," she said at last, because she was not the kind of woman who let kindness go unnamed even when words felt insufficient. He looked at her then fully from under the brim of his hat. In the lantern light his face was angular and weathered, with a long jaw and a mouth that sat in a line that was not unkind, just serious. He gave a single nod. "That repair will hold to Dodge," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who chose words the way he chose his tools. "Get the axle properly replaced there. Do not take it on bad road." "I am headed for Millhaven," she said, "west of Dodge." He looked at her for a moment. 12 miles past Dodge on the Millhaven Trail is mostly smooth," he said. "The repair should hold if you take it slow." "Do you know the trail well?" "Well enough," he said. He was gathering his tools from the ground, replacing them in his saddlebags with the same methodical care he had used to lay them out. "I am Elara Voss," she said. "I am the new schoolteacher for Millhaven." He looked up again. "Cade Aldren," he said. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not quite read. He buckled the saddlebag closed. "You should camp here tonight. Do not push the repair in the full dark." "Is it safe to camp on the trail?" "I will stay close," he said, and it was such a simple statement, delivered with such complete absence of drama, that she believed it entirely. She made her camp, such as it was, spreading her bedroll under the wagon and banking a small fire of dried grass and the few sticks she could gather from the scrub near the trail's edge. He made his own camp a few yards off, rolling out his blanket on the open ground without ceremony, and she watched him from the corner of her eye with the fire between them and the enormous Kansas stars wheeling overhead. She heated water for coffee and poured 2 cups. She carried one to him without being asked, without wondering if she should, and he took it from her with both hands and said thank you in that low, even voice, and she went back to her side of the fire and sat with her own cup and felt, for the first time in months, that she was not entirely alone in the dark. They did not talk a great deal that night, and yet somehow she did not feel the silence as absence. It felt like something shared, like 2 people reading in the same room. She asked him what took him east from Dodge, and he said he had ridden out to check on a cattle track that was supposed to be moved before the fall drive. She asked if he was a rancher, and he said he worked for one, had for 4 years a spread called the Aldren Bar south of Millhaven, and then he said, with the kind of small precision she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, that the Aldren Bar had been his father's ranch, and that his father had died 2 winters ago, and that he was still working out what to do about the future of the place. "You are the owner, then," she said. He looked at the fire. "I suppose I am," he said, as though the fact still surprised him sometimes. She told him she was from St. Louis, that her father had died when she was 12, and her mother just this past spring, that she had wanted to be a teacher since she was old enough to read, that she had chosen Millhaven because the letter from the township had been the most earnest and straightforward of the 3 offers she had received, and that she was not afraid of the frontier, though she acknowledged that a broken axle in the dark was a persuasive argument for caution. He almost smiled at that. The corner of his mouth moved. She noticed. In the morning he was up before her, and when she crawled out from under the wagon she found him harnessing Juniper to the traces. He had also, she realized, checked the wheel nut she had hammered and tightened it properly with a real wrench from his kit. He did this without comment, without calling attention to it, and she felt the now familiar sensation of being watched over without being fussed at, and found she liked it unreasonably. They rode together down the Dodge City Trail in the early light, him on his dark bay horse beside her wagon, the grass golden on either side and the sky a pale and tender blue. They talked more easily in the daylight. She learned that his name was Cade James Aldren, that he was 28 years old, that he had grown up on the ranch and had ridden the trail drives twice before his father fell ill, and it became clear someone needed to stay home. He had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Gil and Pete Sutter, who were honest and hardworking. He had a dog named Biscuit who was neither honest nor hardworking but had considerable character. She laughed at that, a real laugh, and he looked at her with an expression she would think about later, a surprised and wondering look, as though laughter was something he had not expected and found he was glad to have heard. They reached Dodge City by mid-morning. Dodge in 1878 was the particular kind of loud and dusty and vivid that she had been warned about. Front Street was already busy, the Long Branch Saloon doing a trade that surprised her for the hour, drovers and freighters and townspeople moving along the boardwalk, the smell of cattle and horses and fry bread from the restaurant on the corner, a marshal's office with a hand-painted sign, a dry goods store, a livery, a barber, a hotel with a faded painted facade. She navigated the wagon down the main street with care, conscious of the repair she was riding on, and Cade rode beside her without crowding her, a steady presence just off her left shoulder. He helped her find the wheelwright, a bearded German named Hartman who ran his shop at the south end of town, and Hartman examined the repair with visible respect. "This is good work," Hartman said, turning the wire wrap with thick fingers. "Whoever did this knows what they are doing." Cade said nothing. Elara looked at him, and he was examining the wall of wagon wheel hardware with apparent great interest. Hartman had a proper axle that would fit her wagon, and the replacement would take the afternoon. Elara arranged to have lunch at the hotel restaurant, and Cade, after a brief hesitation she noticed and stored away, agreed to join her. The hotel restaurant was plain but clean, with checked tablecloths and good coffee and a menu that ran to beef in most of its forms. They sat across from each other in the afternoon light, and it was different from the fire-lit trail. She could see him clearly, and she suspected he could see her equally well, and there was a quality of mutual assessment in it that she did not find uncomfortable. He was, she thought, genuinely handsome in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, the kind of face built more for endurance than display, with dark brows and good bones, and those quiet gray-blue eyes that she kept finding herself wanting to look at longer than was strictly polite. "What was your mother like?" she asked over the beef stew because she wanted to know more of him than just the surface. He considered the question with a seriousness she appreciated. "Steady," he said. "She was from Ohio originally. She came west for my father and she never once complained about it, but I think she missed trees. Real trees, not the cottonwoods." He paused. "She died when I was 14, fever." "I am sorry," she said. He nodded. "My father raised me the rest of the way. He was a good man, quiet." Another pause. "I think I got a lot of that from him." "The quiet," she said. "The quiet," he confirmed, and the faintest ghost of wry acknowledgment crossed his face. "I do not mind quiet," she said. "I have 24 schoolchildren to talk at, or I will once the school is open. A little quiet in between seems like a reasonable trade." That almost smile again, fuller this time. 24, he said. "Do you know any of them?" "Not yet. I have corresponded with the township clerk, a Mr. Harold Finch, who sent me the names. Ages from 6 to 15. He says several of the older boys are skeptical about the necessity of book learning and may require some convincing." "Sounds about right for ranch boys," Cade said. "Do you have experience with skeptical ranch boys?" "I was one." She put her coffee cup down and looked at him. "Were you difficult to teach?" He thought about it. "I was not difficult once I understood why it mattered. I just needed someone to explain it in terms I could use." He looked at the table, something thoughtful moving behind his eyes. "I wish I had had a better teacher when I was young. The man who ran the school in Millhaven when I was a boy was not particularly interested in teaching. He was interested in leaving." "Well," Elara said, "I am interested in staying." He looked at her at that. She had not meant it to be as much of a declaration as it seemed to land, but she did not take it back. "I am glad to hear it," he said quietly. The axle was replaced by 4 in the afternoon, and Hartman charged her fairly, and she paid him from the coin purse she kept inside her boot, which was a habit her mother had drilled into her on the grounds that a woman traveling alone should keep her money where she could be certain of it. She thanked Hartman warmly, and he touched his hat. Cade appeared at her wagon's side as she was readying Juniper for the road. "The Millhaven Trail branches off the Dodge Road about a mile west of town," he said. "I know the way. If you have no objection, I will ride alongside until you are on familiar ground." "I have no objection," she said, and she tried to keep the warmth out of her voice and was not entirely sure she succeeded. The late afternoon sun was long and golden across the Kansas grass as they rode west out of Dodge, and she felt better than she had in months. The new axle was solid under her, the wagon rolling smoothly, and Juniper had a good stride, and the trail ahead was clear. And Cade Aldren rode on her left side at an easy walk and pointed out landmarks as they passed: the dry creek bed that flooded in spring, the scatter of limestone outcroppings that marked the halfway point, a stand of cottonwoods that meant a well. The Millhaven Trail branched off just where he said it would, a narrower track cutting south and west through the grass. She could see in the middle distance the smudge of buildings that must be the town. She pulled up at the branch and looked at him. "This is where I leave you," he said. "The Aldren Bar is north of here, other side of the creek." He paused. "Millhaven is a good town, the people are fair." "Thank you," she said, "for everything, the axle, the camp, the company." He looked at her for a moment from under his hat brim, and there was something in his face that was neither easy to read nor easy to ignore, a quality of wanting that had not quite made it to his mouth. "I expect I will be in town sometime," he said. "The school is near the post office if I remember right." "I would not know yet," she said, "but I will find out." He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Aldren," she said. and she turned Juniper down the Millhaven trail and drove without looking back, which cost her more effort than she would have liked to admit. Millhaven was a small settlement that had the particular energy of a place, working very hard to become something more than it was. A main street of perhaps 10 storefronts, a church with a raw lumber steeple not yet painted, a hotel and a saloon in careful adjacence to each other, a general store run by a husband and wife named Calloway, a blacksmith, a land office, a post office, and at the end of the street, set back slightly on a lot that had been recently cleared, the new schoolhouse. It was not yet finished. The walls were up and the roof was on and the windows were in, but the interior was still bare boards and sawdust, and the smell of green wood. Harold Finch, the township clerk, was a small, precise man with spectacles and the anxious manner of someone responsible for more things than he was entirely comfortable with. He met her at the hotel and gave her a key and a handshake, and told her the school could be ready for students in 2 weeks if the desks arrived from Wichita as expected, and that the families were eager, and that her room at the Calloway's boarding house would be ready by morning since Mrs. Calloway was still airing it out after the last occupant. The last occupant? Elara asked. A surveyor, Finch said, in a tone that closed the subject. She spent her first night in Millhaven in the hotel, and she lay awake for a while with the sound of the town outside her window, a dog barking, a man's distant laugh from the saloon, the creak of the building in the wind, and she thought about the trail from Dodge and the man who had ridden beside her through the afternoon gold. She had fallen in love, she thought, or the beginning of it, standing beside a broken wagon in the dark watching a silent man work with patient and capable hands. She had not expected it. She did not entirely trust it. But she knew the feeling well enough to name it, even if naming it felt premature, even reckless, for a woman who had just arrived in a new place and had no ground yet under her feet. She told herself she would be sensible about it. She was not, as a general rule, very good at being sensible about things she felt deeply. Millhaven absorbed her quickly. Mrs. Calloway, whose boarding house occupied a well-kept building on the side street behind the general store, turned out to be a warm and talkative woman in her late 40s who had strong opinions about everything, and delivered them with such cheerful certainty that they were difficult to resist. She had 3 other boarders, a land assessor named Prout who was quiet, a young woman named Clara Webb who ran the millinery, and an older man named Amos Dye who said he was a retired freighter and whose primary occupation appeared to be sitting on the porch and watching the street. Clara became Elara's first friend in Millhaven, with the particular speed that loneliness allows. She was 22 and originally from Indiana, with red hair and a direct manner and a laugh that came easily, and she had been in Millhaven for a year and knew everyone's business in the way that the only milliner in a small town inevitably does. You came through Dodge, Clara said over supper on Elara's second evening. By yourself? More or less, Elara said. I had some help on the trail. What kind of help? Elara considered. My axle broke, she said. A rancher fixed it. Clara looked at her with the shrewd attention of a woman who catalogued information for a living. A rancher, she said. A rancher, Elara confirmed. What rancher? Cade Aldren. Clara put down her fork. Cade Aldren fixed your axle in the dark. It was not fully dark, Elara said, which was not true. How do you know him? Everyone knows the Aldrens. His father was one of the first ranchers through here. His mother was a lovely woman, died when Cade was young. Clara picked up her fork again and resumed eating with an expression of immense restraint that was obviously costing her something. He is a good man, keeps to himself. So I observed, Elara said. He does not come to town very often, Clara said. Gil and Pete Sutter ride in for supplies sometimes. Cade mostly sends orders. She paused. His father's death hit him hard. They were close. He has been running that ranch mostly alone. Elara looked at her plate. She thought of what he had said about the quiet, about getting it from his father. She thought of a man who had taken on the entirety of a loss and a responsibility in the same moment and had simply kept working, the way he had kept working on her axle in the dark. "He seems like the kind of man," Elara said carefully, "who does not ask for much." "No," Clara agreed. "He does not." The schoolhouse was finished on time, the desks from Wichita arriving with 2 days to spare. Elara spent those 2 days arranging the classroom, with a happy absorption that she found deeply restorative after the uncertainty of the road. She set the desks in rows, chalked the board, arranged the primer books and the slates, hung the map of the United States that she had carried all the way from St. Louis, and set a jar of dried wildflowers on her desk, because she believed strongly that a classroom should be a place children were glad to enter. The first day of school brought 21 students, ranging from Alice Finch, who was 6 and sat in the front row with enormous solemnity and a brand new slate pencil, to the Hendry boys, who were 15 and 14, and arrived with the studied indifference of young men who had decided in advance that this experience held nothing for them. Elara had dealt with Hendry boys before, in different names and different towns. She knew what to do with them. She taught them history first, specifically the history of cattle drives and the economic mechanics of the beef trade, and she watched the careful indifference on the Hendry faces begin to crack before she was halfway through the lesson. By the time she had described the logistics of the Kishom Trail in genuine geographic detail, Danny Hendry, the older one, was leaning forward with his elbows on his desk. She had them all by lunchtime. She was locking the schoolhouse at the end of her 3rd day when she heard a horse on the street and looked up and found Cade Aldren sitting his dark bay at the rail in front of the post office. He had come for mail, she guessed, and she told herself that she was not going to make anything of it, was not going to cross the street on a pretext, was not going to manufacture an encounter like a girl in a novel. She crossed the street. "Mr. Aldren," she said. He looked up from the folded letters he had taken from the post office, and for one unguarded moment she saw something light in his face before he arranged it back into its usual measured expression. "Miss Voss," he said. "How is Millhaven treating you?" "Very well," she said. "The school opened on Monday, 21 students." 21, he said. "That is more than I expected. Families came in from the outlying farms and ranches," she said. "Several of them ride a fair distance." She paused. "Did you ever ride a fair distance to school? 4 miles each way," he said, "when there was school to ride to, and when there was not. My mother taught me at home until she died. Then my father did what he could. He read well, better than most." She thought of a boy of 14 on a ranch without his mother, learning from his father's steady hands and the books they had. She felt a surge of feeling for both of them that she could not entirely account for. "Would you like to see the schoolhouse?" she asked. "I have been quite proud of how it has come together." He looked at her for a moment. Then he tied his horse at the post office rail and came with her. She showed him the classroom in the late afternoon light, the rows of desks and the chalkboard and the map on the wall. And she told him about her students with the natural enthusiasm of someone who had found her purpose and lived it every day. She told him about the Hendry boys and their conversion via cattle economics, and about Alice Finch, who was already reading ahead in the primer, and about the 3 children from the Navarro family who spoke Spanish at home and were the most diligent students she had ever taught. He listened to all of it without interruption, standing by the window with his hat in his hands, and she was aware again of that quality of attention he had, the sense that when he listened he did it completely, that nothing she said was being half heard or filed away as unimportant. "You are good at this," he said when she had finished. "I love it," she said simply. "Is that enough to be good at something?" He looked at the chalkboard. "I think it might be most of it," he said. They walked back to his horse in the soft, early evening light, and she asked him what he was doing about the fall cattle drive, because Clara had mentioned that the Aldren Bar ran a herd of perhaps 200 head and decisions about the drive were being made this month. He talked about it with more animation than she had seen from him, the decisions about timing and route, and the current state of the cattle market, the difficulty of hiring reliable drovers for a small, independent operation when the big outfits paid better. He was not complaining. He was simply reporting the facts of a complicated situation with the practical clarity of a man who dealt in facts. She asked good questions, she thought. She knew enough about the economics of ranching from her reading, and from conversations she had had on the road to keep up, and she could see him adjusting to that, recalibrating from a simplified explanation toward something more complete. "You know about ranching," he said, with a note of mild surprise. "I know about most things at a surface level," she said. "It is the chief advantage of being a person who reads everything she can find. I know a little about a great many things, and I can ask the right questions to learn more." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say the most useful thing a person could do was know what they did not know." "Your father was wise," she said. "He was," Cade said. Something moved across his face that she recognized as grief, the old quiet kind, the kind that has been carried long enough to lose its sharp edges but has not disappeared. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her from the saddle with the last light behind him, the plains gold and endless in every direction, and she thought again about the dark trail and the lantern and the wire wrapped tight around the broken axle. "I will be in town Friday for supplies," he said. "Would you take supper with me?" "If you have no other engagement." Her heart did something quick and definite. "I have no other engagement on Friday," she said. He nodded. "The hotel restaurant," he said. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, she confirmed. He touched his hat and rode north, and she stood in the street and watched him go, and Mrs. Calloway, who was sweeping the porch of the boarding house across the way, watched all of it with visible satisfaction and said nothing whatsoever. He arrived at 7 on Friday in a clean shirt the color of a storm cloud and his good hat, and he was early, which she appreciated. She arrived at 2 minutes before 7 in the blue dress she had brought from St. Louis because it was her best, and she had told herself firmly that she was not dressing for him, but had put it on anyway. The hotel dining room was warm and lit with oil lamps, and smelled of roast beef and coffee, and the other diners gave them no more than the natural curiosity that a new face in a small town always attracts. They talked through 3 courses and 2 pots of coffee, and she forgot entirely to be careful or strategic or modest in her enthusiasm. She talked about the books she loved, about the history of the territories and what she believed the frontier West was doing to American life and culture, about the question of statehood for Kansas, and what it meant practically for schools and roads and governance. He listened and questioned, and offered his own views with a directness she found wholly refreshing. No posturing, no performance of having opinions he did not hold. He told her about the ranch in the way a man talks about something that is both burden and love, the daily work of it, the particular satisfactions, the hard months after his father died when he had not been certain he could or should hold on to it. He had nearly sold it to the land company that had been circling Millhaven properties since the year before. "What stopped you?" she asked. "I could not imagine anyone else on the land," he said. "It sounds strange, but the land was my father's and my grandfather's before him. We broke that ground. I did not want to watch someone else's cattle on it." "That does not sound strange at all," she said. They were the last diners in the restaurant. The owner, a patient man named Greer, was wiping down tables in the far corner with the dignified resignation of a person waiting for people to realize they have overstayed. Elara noticed and felt faintly guilty and amused in equal measure. They stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel in the cool evening, and the stars were out, enormous and crowded the way prairie stars always were, and she thought this was almost exactly what the trail had felt like 2 weeks ago, except with more light and less emergency, and she felt the same quiet rightness of it. "I had a very good evening," she said. "I did too," he said. He was standing close enough that she could see the particular quality of his attention, the focused stillness of him. "I do not do this often," he said. "Have supper with someone," he paused, "with a woman. I had guessed that, she said gently. Am I obvious? No, she said, just honest. There is a difference. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was more open than anything she had seen from him, and then he said, I would like to see you again, Elara. Her given name, for the first time, simply and carefully. If you are willing. I am very willing, she said. He walked her back to the boarding house, and at the gate he said good night and touched his hat and rode north in the dark. And she stood at the gate for a moment after he had gone and put her hand on the post and felt the solid wood of it and thought, there it is. There is the thing. October in Kansas was a transformation, the grass going gold and rust, the nights cooling sharply, the air carrying the smell of turned earth from farms getting their last work done before frost. Elara settled into the rhythm of Millhaven with a completeness that surprised her. She had been afraid, in her most honest private moments, that she would feel marooned in a small western town after St. Louis, that the smallness of it would press on her. Instead, she found that smallness had its own richness, that knowing the names of every student and every parent, that being the person people sought out with questions and trusted with their children, was a different and deeper kind of belonging than anything the city had offered. She and Cade Aldren found their rhythm too, a careful and deliberate courtship conducted in the full view of a small town that noticed everything. He came into Millhaven on Fridays, and she met him after school. They ate supper and they walked and they talked, and the talking was the heart of it, the pleasure of two people discovering the shape of each other's minds with the sustained attention of people who take both minds and people seriously. He came one Sunday in late October, and they rode out to the Aldren bar, because she had asked to see it, and he had agreed with a seriousness that suggested he understood what the invitation meant. The ranch was beautiful in the fall light, a long low house of timber and stone with a broad porch, a solid barn, corrals with good fencing, the grass rolling away to the creek where the cottonwoods had gone butter yellow. Gil and Pete Sutter, the ranch hands, were working near the barn and greeted her with the direct and evaluating courtesy of men who cared about their employers' choices and were not going to pretend otherwise. She liked them immediately. Gil was the older brother, perhaps 30, with a red beard and a thoughtful manner. Pete was 25 and had a quick grin and a habit of finishing other people's sentences that he seemed entirely unaware of. They showed her the horses with the proprietary pride of people who knew good animals and were glad to show them off, and she asked good questions about the stock, and she could feel Cade watching her from a slight distance with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, a quiet pleasure, a kind of wondering. He showed her the house. It was spare in the way of a bachelor's house but not uncared for, a main room with a stone fireplace, and a good rug and shelves of books along one wall, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, and a table large enough for 8, 2 bedrooms, a study where his father's papers were still stacked in a way that suggested he had not quite been able to sort through them yet. She ran her finger along the spines of the books on the shelf. History, natural science, a complete Shakespeare, 2 copies of the King James Bible at different degrees of wear, a battered almanac, and a row of cattle industry publications. At the end of the shelf, wedged between the almanac and a book on veterinary medicine, was a small, worn volume of poems. She pulled it out. George Gordon Byron. The pages were soft with use. She looked at him. He was watching from the doorway, arms crossed, a rueful look on his face as though she had discovered something he had not intended. Your father's, she guessed. Mine, he said. She turned the book over in her hands. I did not know you read poetry. I do not advertise it, he said. Why not? He looked at the window. It does not fit the general picture, he said, and she understood him perfectly. A rancher on the Kansas plains in 1878, and the particular masculine economy of that world, and what it cost to admit to the tender things. She put the book back carefully, spine out, in its place on the shelf. I think the general picture is considerably improved by it, she said. He looked at her from the doorway with an expression that did her considerable damage to her composure, and she turned back to the shelf to give herself a moment to recover. Biscuit the dog, who had been introduced earlier with great ceremony, and was a medium-sized brown animal of no discernible breed and immense personal confidence, inserted himself between them and sneezed authoritatively, and they both laughed, which released the moment into something lighter and easier. They ate lunch at his kitchen table, eggs and salt pork and bread she had brought from Mrs. Calloway's kitchen, and afterward they sat on the porch with coffee and looked at the land in the afternoon. The wind was steady from the north, and the cottonwoods along the creek made their silver-gold sound, and she thought this was one of the most beautiful places she had ever been. "Do you think you will stay?" he asked. It was not a casual question. It was carrying more weight than its words, and they both knew it. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I belong here now, I can feel it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad," with a simplicity that was more eloquent than a paragraph would have been. In November the first snow came, light and early, and the schoolhouse was cold at the mornings until Elara lit the stove and the room warmed to something livable. She had ordered additional primers from a publisher in Chicago and a set of arithmetic books from a school supply company in Kansas City. And when the boxes arrived, she unpacked them with the happiness of a person whose world is exactly the right size. One of her students, the youngest of the Navarro children, a boy named Raphael who was 7 years old, and had the focused intelligence of someone who understood that the world contained more than he had yet learned, appeared one morning with a bruise on his jaw that he said was from a fall. She did not press him in class. She sent a note home with the older Navarro children, addressed to their mother, and 2 days later Catalina Navarro appeared at the schoolhouse after hours. She was a small and composed woman of perhaps 30, and the conversation was difficult, navigated partly in English and partly in the Spanish that Elara had learned from her reading and from the Navarro children's patient corrections over the past 2 months. The bruise was not from a fall. There was a man in the household, a relative of the children's father who had arrived from Albuquerque in September and whose presence had made the house unsafe. Elara listened carefully and completely, the same way Cade listened, and then she helped Catalina think through the options, which in a small western town in 1878 were fewer than they should have been and required more courage than anyone should have had to spend. She went with Catalina to speak to the sheriff, a sensible man named Harlow who took the matter seriously and acted on it, and the relative from Albuquerque was escorted off the Navarro property by the end of the week. It was not a perfect resolution, and Elara was clear-eyed about the larger injustices that made such situations so precarious for women and for families who were already navigating the indifference of a society that often failed to see them fully. But it was what she could do, and she did it completely. Catalina Navarro brought her a jar of preserved peppers and a piece of embroidered cotton the following Monday, and they regarded each other with the mutual respect of people who have been honest with each other about hard things. She told Cade about it on Friday, over supper. He listened with the full attention she now knew to expect from him, and when she had finished he said, "You were right to help her." "There should have been more I could do," she said. "There should have been a different world," he said, "but you worked in the one we have got." She looked at him across the table. "You understand these things more than most men I have known," she said. "My mother had a difficult situation once," he said. "Before my father, she did not talk about it much, but I understood enough." She did not press for more, and he did not offer more, and it was one of those moments that said something without saying it, that built the architecture of what they were to each other in a way that words alone would have been too thin to accomplish. December arrived with cold and the particular beauty of a Kansas winter, the land simplified to its bones under the flat white sky, the creek frozen at its edges, the cottonwoods bare and silver. Elara conducted the school's first winter term with a fire roaring in the cast iron stove and wool mittens on half the students, and a conviction that education could not wait on weather. She and Cade had reached a point in their courtship that everyone in Millhaven had an opinion about, because everyone in Millhaven had an opinion about everything, and the school's teacher and the Aldren bar rancher were the most interesting ongoing narrative the town had produced in a considerable time. Mrs. Calloway offered daily commentary at breakfast. Clara Webb was relentlessly enthusiastic and also relentlessly curious about the details that Elara chose not to share. Amos Dye, on the porch, watched the Friday arrivals with the attentiveness of a man who had found his theater. Cade appeared one Tuesday afternoon unannounced, which was unusual, and she was erasing the chalkboard when she heard the door and turned and found him standing in the classroom doorway with snow on his hat and an expression she had not seen before, urgent and resolved, as though he had talked himself into something. "I need to ask you something," he said. She set down the eraser. "All right," she said. "I should have planned this better," he said. "I had a plan and I lost it on the ride-in." He took off his hat and held it in both hands, and she saw that he was genuinely nervous, a thing she had never seen from him, and the sight of it moved her enormously. "I know that we have only known each other since September," he said, "and I know that you have just arrived here and have your school to build and your life to settle, and I know that I am not a man who says things easily or particularly well, but I need you to know that you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and that since the night on the trail I have not been able to imagine going back to the way things were before." He stopped, swallowed. "Elara," he said, "I would like to ask if you will marry me. Not now if you are not ready, not soon if you need more time, but I need to ask because not asking would be dishonest and I cannot be dishonest with you." She looked at him across the empty classroom, the winter light coming through the windows, the map of the United States on the wall, the jar of dried wildflowers on her desk, and she thought about broken axles and lantern light, and the sound of wire wrapping tight in the dark. And she thought about a man who fixed things without being asked, and listened with his whole attention, and kept Byron's poems between the almanac and the veterinary medicine, and was standing in her classroom with snow on his hat and no plan at all. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Cade." He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding. Something settled in his face, something that had been held carefully in tension releasing into a warmth that changed him entirely, made him younger and more open and more completely himself than she had seen. He crossed the classroom and took her hands in his, and he stood there looking at her for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Elara." She laughed because it was such a Cade thing to say, grateful and direct and without any decoration, and she squeezed his hands and said, "Thank you for asking." They were married in February of 1879, in the raw lumber church with the unpainted steeple, on a Saturday when the cold was fierce but the sun was brilliant on the snow. Reverend Marks officiated, a tall, thin man with a sonorous voice and kind eyes. Mrs. Calloway cried from the second row, which she had predicted she would do and did not seem embarrassed about. Clara Webb was Elara's only attendant and wore her best green dress and could not stop smiling. Gil and Pete Sutter sat together in the fourth row in their good shirts, their hats in their laps, Pete nudging Gil when he should nudge him. Harold Finch was there with his wife and his daughter Alice, who was Elara's most diligent student, and who regarded the whole ceremony with the solemn attention she applied to everything. The Navarro family was there, Catalina and her children, including Raphael, who had grown a full inch since September and was reading at a third-grade level. Amos Dye was there, having walked from the boarding house in his Sunday coat, and he watched the whole proceeding with the satisfied expression of a man whose judgment about a narrative had been vindicated. Cade stood at the front of the church and watched her walk the aisle in her blue dress with winter light coming through the tall windows, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, open and complete and luminous, and she held his gaze the entire length of the aisle because she did not want to look anywhere else. He said his vows in the low, even voice she had come to love more than any other sound, and she said hers with the clear certainty of someone who had thought carefully about what they were promising and had no reservations about any of it. And Reverend Marks pronounced them married, and Cade kissed her with a gentleness that was also somehow absolute. A kiss that said, "This is serious, and this is real, and I am not going to waste a moment of it." The wedding supper was in the hotel dining room, pushed to accommodate 30 people, with a fiddle player named Two-Step Maginty who turned out to be genuinely excellent, and who played for 3 hours without repeating himself. Pete Sutter danced with Clara Webb with more enthusiasm than skill, and both of them found this hilarious. Gil danced with Mrs. Calloway with unexpected grace. Harold Finch attempted a reel and survived it. Elara danced with her husband, and the first time she thought the word husband in reference to Cade Aldren, she felt a deep and happy astonishment at how much had happened since a September evening on a dark trail. They rode out to the Aldren bar in the late evening, under a sky absolutely loaded with stars, and the cold was so clean and sharp that every breath felt like drinking something. The ranch was dark when they arrived, and Gil had laid a fire ready in the main room fireplace, and Cade lit it while she put the kettle on, and they stood in the firelight of his father's house that was now their house together, and the warmth built around them, and it was simple and complete and entirely sufficient. She had her books unpacked on the shelves within the week, her own alongside his, the Byron no longer wedged apologetically between the almanac and the veterinary medicine, but moved to a better position at eye level where she told him it deserved to be. He watched her do it with a look of such quiet happiness that she had to stop and put her hands on his face and look at him directly for a moment. "You are allowed to be happy," she told him. He put his hands over hers. "I know," he said, and she could tell from the way he said it that it was something he had needed to practice believing. The spring brought new growth to the Aldren bar in more ways than the obvious. Cade hired a third hand, a young man named Tomás Vega who had ridden up from Texas with a letter of reference from a rancher Cade trusted, and Tomás turned out to be excellent with horses and a steady worker, and a man who spent his evenings reading one of the books from their shelf that she had pressed on him. He sent money home to his mother in San Antonio every month with the conscientiousness of someone who did not forget where he had come from. Elara's second year of school saw enrollment rise to 28 students because 2 new families had arrived in Millhaven over the winter, and because word had traveled among the outlying farms and ranches that the schoolteacher was worth the ride. She had her students from 6 to 16 now, and she organized the older ones into reading groups where they helped teach the younger ones, which was pedagogically sound, and also served to give the older ones a stake in the enterprise that pure student status had not. She found that spring that she was going to have a child. She told Cade in the kitchen on a morning in April, with the back door open and the new green smell of the prairie coming in, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her carefully, as though she might be fragile, which she found amusing enough to tell him. "I am not made of glass," she said into his shoulder. "I am made of considerably sturdier material." He pulled back and looked at her with that luminous open expression she had first seen at their wedding. "I know you are," he said. "I am the one having the feeling." "Are you happy?" she asked. "Elara," he said in the tone of a man for whom the question was almost comically inadequate. She laughed and leaned into him and felt him breathe, and they stood in their kitchen in the April morning with new life beginning around them and inside them, and it was one of the finest moments she had ever experienced. She taught through the spring term and into early summer, finishing the school year while the child grew, and the women of Millhaven, led by the indefatigable Mrs. Calloway, organized a practical assistance that she accepted with gratitude and some amusement, arriving at intervals with food and advice and strong opinions about everything from delivery positions to the name. The child was born in early October of 1879, a boy, in the bedroom of the Aldren bar with a midwife named Hannah Price, who had delivered half the children in the county, and had the calm of someone who had seen every possible variation on the experience and found most of them manageable. Cade sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and his face doing things that Gil and Pete, who had come in from the bunkhouse to wait, pretended not to notice. When Hannah Price opened the door and told him he had a son, he stood up and stood very still for a moment, and then he went in. The boy was red and indignant and had Cade's jaw and Elara's dark hair, and an opinion about the world that he was expressing at volume. Elara was exhausted and brilliant with it, propped against the pillows with the child in her arms, and she looked at Cade when he came through the door with the steady eyes of a woman who had just done something very large and knew it. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child with an expression she had never seen on his face, something beyond happiness, past the familiar edges of even the most tender moments they had shared. Then he put a careful hand on the child's head and looked at Elara. "He is real," Cade said, which was not the most articulate thing he had ever said and was also exactly right. They named him William James Aldren, William for Elara's father and James for Cade's father, and he was from his first hours a person of considerable personality. The years that followed were full in the way of good years, layered and various and shaped by the specific textures of the life they had built. William grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity, which was a potent combination, and he was in Elara's classroom from the age of 6, with the strange doubled privilege of being both her son and her student, a situation they navigated with the particular mixture of rigor and love that she brought to everything. Clara Webb and Pete Sutter, after a courtship that had more drama than either of them would later admit, married in the summer of 1881 and moved into a house on the edge of town that Pete built himself with Gil's help and Cade's oversight. Clara kept the millinery and Pete worked the ranch, and they were happy in the uncomplicated way of people who have chosen well. The Aldren bar prospered. Cade expanded the herd in 1882 when the market was strong and the grass had been good 2 seasons running, and he brought on 2 more hands. He bought additional land from the adjacent property when the previous owner decided to return east, doubling the spread's acreage. He was not a man who chased wealth, but he was a man who worked completely at whatever he had chosen, and the ranch reflected it. Elara's school grew as Millhaven grew, and by 1883 she had 40 students and the pressing need for a second teacher, which the township provided in the form of a young woman from Ohio named Margaret Holt, who was 23 and earnest and terrified and wonderful, and whom Elara mentored with the patience of a woman who remembered very clearly what it had felt like to be new somewhere. She and Cade had their second child in 1882, a girl they named Helen, after Cade's mother. Helen arrived with less drama than William had, and settled into the household with a serenity that was either temperamental or a negotiating strategy, and which remained ambiguous for several years. William adored her with the wholehearted devotion of a firstborn who had been told a sibling was coming and had decided to make the best of it, and then discovered it was in fact an improvement. There were hard things too, because there are always hard things. The winter of 1883 was savage, the worst Kansas had seen in a decade, and the cattle losses were real and painful, and there were weeks when the cold was so relentless that everything on the ranch was about survival and endurance with nothing left over for anything else. Cade worked through it with the same methodical steadiness that she had first seen by lantern light on a dark trail, and she worked through it beside him, and they came out the other side in the March thaw with the herd diminished but intact and themselves intact, and the knowledge of what they could withstand together, which was considerable. There was a summer in 1884 when a land company made aggressive moves to buy up property in the Millhaven area, approaching ranchers and farmers with offers that were not quite coercive but were close enough. Several families sold, feeling the pressure. Cade did not sell. He attended the township meeting where the issue was debated, and he spoke plainly and without heat about what the community stood to lose if independent holdings were consolidated into corporate ownership, and he helped organize a collective response that gave the smaller landholders enough collective standing to resist the pressure. He was not political by nature, but he was clear about what mattered, and when something mattered, he was entirely willing to say so. Elara watched him from the back of the meeting room and felt the particular deep satisfaction of loving someone not just for what they were to her, but for what they were in themselves. She told him so later that night, sitting on the porch in the summer dark with coffee going cold in their cups and the sound of the nighthawks over the creek. "I am proud of you," she said, "not just tonight, in general, but tonight specifically." He looked at her with an expression that was still, after 6 years of marriage, capable of affecting her composure. "You were back there watching," he said. "That helped." "I did not do anything," she said. "You were there," he said, as though that answered it completely, which she thought it did. The school in Millhaven became one of the finest in the county over the years that followed, and Elara's reputation as an educator spread enough that she received 2 offers to take positions in Wichita and 1 in Kansas City, and she declined all of them without very much deliberation, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the prestige of the offers was flattering. Millhaven was where she was, and where she was where she wanted to be, and that was a clarity she trusted. She and Margaret Holt developed the curriculum together into something genuinely good, something that served the farm and ranch children of the county with a seriousness about their actual lives and futures, rather than the Eastern urban curriculum that most school boards defaulted to without much thought. She fought for the Navarro children and the children of 2 Cherokee families who settled near Millhaven in 1882, insisting on their full inclusion in the school when there were voices in the township who would have preferred to arrange things differently. She did not fight loudly. She fought with the same steady completeness that she did everything. Rafael Navarro, who had been 7 years old with a bruised jaw when she arrived in Millhaven, grew into a young man who could read in 2 languages and do sums faster than most adults, and had decided he wanted to be a doctor. In 1885, at 17, he left for Kansas City to pursue his schooling, and Elara and Catalina stood together on the Millhaven platform watching the eastbound stage carry him away, and Elara felt the particular bittersweet fullness of watching someone you helped take the shape of go out and use it. William Aldren, at 6, had his father's way with animals and his mother's way with words, a combination that expressed itself in a child who could talk the rangy cattle dog into sitting still, and who read everything in the house, including the veterinary medicine and the poetry and most of the almanacs. He was in school when Elara had 2 classes, and she made no favoritism, but she also could not entirely hide from herself, or from Cade, the pleasure of seeing her son absorb the world with the same earnest hunger she had always felt. Helen, at 3, was a person of decided opinions and considerable charm, and she had her father's capacity for silence deployed, Elara suspected, with much more strategic intent than Cade had ever employed. She sat on the porch with Cade in the evenings and regarded the plains with a seriousness that made both of her parents work to keep straight faces. On a Friday evening in the autumn of 1885, 7 years after a dark trail east of Dodge and a broken axle, and a man who had appeared out of the night and worked in silence with patient, capable hands, Cade and Elara sat on the porch of the Aldren bar in the last of the light. The grass was gold again the way it had been the first time she had seen this land, and the cottonwoods were doing their October thing, going yellow and bright, and the sky was enormous and tender in the particular western way that she had loved since the first day she had driven a wagon into it. William was in the barn with Gil, learning something about horses. Helen was inside with Mrs. Calloway, who came out on Fridays sometimes, ostensibly to help with supper, but primarily because she loved the children and they loved her, and because Elara and Cade had become something like family to her since the death of Mr. Calloway 2 years before. They sat in their chairs with their coffee and the evening around them, and Cade said, without preamble, in the way he had of saying things that mattered, with the directness of someone who had stopped apologizing for having feelings. "I think about that trail sometimes. The night we met." She looked at him. The light was doing what prairie light does in October, going gold and horizontal and impossibly beautiful. "So do I," she said. "Often." "You had a shotgun," he said. "I had very good reasons for a shotgun," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I noticed you were careful with it, not reckless, just ready." "I noticed you did not say a word," she said. "Not a greeting, not an introduction. You just got down and started working." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know what to say," he admitted. "And the axle needed fixing. It seemed more useful to fix it first." "It was," she said. "It was exactly right. It was more reassuring than anything you could have said." He turned his head and looked at her. The evening was gold on his face, and she saw the years of it and the life of it, and all of it was good. "I was not trying to impress you," he said. "I know," she said. "That was what impressed me." He reached over and took her hand on the armrest between their chairs, the way he had taken to doing in the evenings, the simple, solid fact of it. And they sat with the plains before them and their house behind them and their children's voices drifting from inside and from the barn. And the light went from gold to rose to the first pale edge of dark. And the stars came out one by one over Kansas, the way they had come out on a trail east of Dodge 7 years ago when the world was different. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. Not just the place, though the place was real and hers and beloved, but the belonging that came from being known by someone who had chosen to know you and kept choosing it. The ordinary dailiness of a life built with someone who showed up and worked and listened and held your hand in the evening. She had been, she thought, a woman who had arrived in the dark with a broken axle and very little certainty, and what she had found was not just repair but everything. "Cade," she said. "Elara," he said, the way he had always said her name, carefully and completely, as though it was something worth taking care of. "I am very happy," she said. He squeezed her hand. "I know," he said. "So am I." And then, because he was Cade Aldren, and some things did not need more words than they needed, "I intend to stay that way." She laughed, and the laugh went out across the porch and the grass in the evening, and somewhere in the barn William's voice rose in response to something Gil had said. And inside the house, Helen's laugh answered like an echo, and the stars were fully out now over the Kansas plains, and the Aldren bar stood solid in the dark, and the man beside her held her hand, and it was enough, and it was everything. And it was exactly what she had not known. She was riding toward on a September evening in 1878, with a broken axle and a lantern, and all the rest of her life still ahead of her in the dark. In the years after, when Millhaven had grown enough to have a second story on the hotel and a proper physician's office and a telegraph line running to Dodge, when the schoolhouse had been expanded twice, and Elara had trained 3 new teachers in the methods she had developed over a decade of practice, when William was tall and serious, and learning the ranch alongside his father with a seriousness that moved Cade visibly and often. When Helen was reading everything she could find and asking questions at dinner that required the entire family to think carefully before answering. When Rafael Navarro came back through Millhaven briefly on his way to a medical posting in Colorado and stopped at the schoolhouse with his physician's bag, and the particular quiet dignity of someone who had made something real of himself and knew it and was grateful. When Clara and Pete Sutter's house had grown 2 additions and 2 children and a third on the way. When Amos Dye had finally left his porch to try his daughter's ranch in Nebraska and had sent back 1 letter saying it was not as bad as he had feared. When all of these things had happened and continued to happen in the layered and various and entirely unrepeatable way of real life, Elara would sometimes sit in her classroom in the early morning before the students arrived and look at the map of the United States on the wall. The same map she had carried from St. Louis and hung on her first day, and she would think about the road that had led her here. She had not planned any of it. She had planned the teaching and the westward journey and the new start in a new place, But she had not planned the broken axle or the dark trail or the man who appeared out of the night with tools and silence and entirely capable hands. She had not planned to fall in love in a moment that contained no words at all, nothing but the sound of wire wrapping tight and the lantern light on a capable face, and the certainty that this was a person who could be trusted with anything. She had not planned any of it, and it was the finest thing that had ever happened to her. Cade appeared in the classroom doorway one October morning in 1887, 9 years after the trail, with his hat in his hands and a look of concentrated feeling that she recognized as the precursor to something he had been building up to saying. "William wants to ride the spring drive," he said. "He is old enough to help. I wanted to ask you first." "He is 12, she said. "I rode with my father at 12, Cade said. She looked at him for a moment. "Were you careful?" "I was," he said. "Will you be there the whole drive?" "Every mile," he said. She thought about her son, who had his father's hands and his father's steadiness, and his mother's clear-eyed assessment of what was actually in front of him rather than what he wished was. She thought about the things that could not be learned in a classroom, that could only be learned in motion and work and the company of other people doing real things in the real world. "All right," she said, "but he reads on the drive. I will send books." The corner of Cade's mouth moved. "Books on a cattle drive," he said. "The Cowboys will just have to manage," she said. He was across the classroom in a few steps, and he kissed her once, firmly and warmly, in the way of a man who had been kissing his wife for 9 years and still meant it every time. And he said, "Thank you." And she said, "Tell him from me that the arithmetic does not stop just because he is on a horse." He laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh she had spent the first weeks of their acquaintance working toward and had never tired of, and he put his hat on and went out into the October morning, and she watched him go from the classroom window, and she thought, there it is. Still there. Still the same. Still the thing. She turned back to her desk and picked up the chalk and began writing the day's lesson on the board. And the autumn light came through the clean glass windows of the schoolhouse that she had made into something she was proud of. And outside, she could hear Millhaven waking up to another day. The particular busy small-town sound of a place that was alive and growing and full of people whose children she taught and whose lives she was part of. And she wrote the lesson on the board with the strong, clean strokes of a woman entirely in her place. And she was deeply, completely, and permanently at home. The axle had broken on a September evening in 1878, and a silent man with capable hands had fixed it in the dark, and she had fallen in love right there, on the side of a trail in the Kansas grass, with the stars coming out overhead, and the lantern burning low and the whole enormous rest of her life still to be lived. And she had lived it, and it had been magnificent.